In late June 2026, something happened in Germany that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Volkswagen, the company that literally defined post-war German prosperity, confirmed it is considering closing up to 4 domestic factories, not 1, but 4. Alongside this, up to 100,000 jobs are now on the line. For context, that is roughly the entire population of a mid-sized German city. Just 10 years ago, Volkswagen sold over 10 million vehicles globally. It was the world's largest automaker. Today, it is struggling to keep its own factories running. Most Western media quickly points fingers. Cheap Chinese electric vehicles flooded into the market and crushed Europe's auto industry. But is it true? Let us go back to the year 2001. China joined the World Trade Organization. At the time, European policymakers were confident, almost casually so. The assumption in Brussels was simple: China will become the world's assembly line. Europe will remain the world's innovation lab. And for a while, that assumption made perfect sense. Europe has brands, Europe has patents, Europe has engineering universities. China has cheap labor and low environmental standards. It was a marriage of convenience, and Europe believed it was the senior partner. Over the next 7 years, European companies did exactly what their governments encouraged them to do. They outsourced production. They closed local factories. They sent blueprints to suppliers in Guangdong and Zhejiang. They kept design, marketing, and finance in Frankfurt, Munich, and London. While European companies were busy optimizing quarterly profits, Chinese local governments were building something far more durable: highways, port, power grids, industrial parks, each one designed not for one factory, but for an entire supply chain. Engineering universities were expanded. Graduates in electrical and mechanical engineering, tens of thousands every year, were funneled directly into manufacturing ecosystems. Every port expansion, every supplier cluster, every logistics network, none of this happened by accident. By 2015, when Beijing formally announced the Made in China 2025 strategy, it was largely dismissed in Brussels as a standard political slogan. Few in Europe realized it was actually an industrial roadmap. And here is the uncomfortable truth that Europe is only now beginning to understand. Manufacturing itself became innovation. For decades, Europe believed that innovation meant designing something new: a better engine, a more efficient turbine, a sleeker dashboard. But China discovered something different. Innovation also means making something better, faster, and cheaper at scale. When you produce 50 million batteries a year, you do not just assemble them. You learn, you optimize, your suppliers learn. Their suppliers learn. That accumulated knowledge embedded in machines, software, and millions of worker hours is not easily replicated, and it certainly cannot be regulated away. Then came 2022, when Russian pipeline gas largely disappeared from the European energy mix. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Electricity prices for industrial users in Germany spiked by over 300%. Steel, chemicals, automotive parts, every energy-intensive industry suddenly faced a cost structure that made no economic sense. Climate targets remained in place, but the factories that were supposed to meet those targets gradually disappeared. And at exactly the same moment, Chinese manufacturers arrived with fully integrated supply chains, capable of delivering batteries, solar panels, and EV components at prices European companies could not match, not because China had suddenly gotten lucky, because China had spent 20 years building the ecosystem that Europe had spent 20 years outsourcing. So when European policymakers today look at Volkswagen's factory closures, they see a crisis caused by unfair competition. But what they are actually seeing is the accumulated result of a 30-year strategic choice. Europe chose to separate design from production. It believed intellectual property was permanent, and that manufacturing could always be brought back. China chose to integrate design and production. It believed that making things, really making them at scale, was the foundation of technological power. Those two strategies are now colliding. And the collision is happening not in boardrooms, but on factory floors, in workers' wages and the economic stability of entire regions. Today, Brussels is building walls. New regulations, carbon tariffs, supply chain audits. But here is the question that will define the next decade. Can regulation really replace 30 years of industrial capability? Because if Europe believes that regulatory adjustments alone can substitute for lost industrial capacity, it may find itself managing a decline rather than engineering a resurgence. In the first half of 2026, while the world was watching Washington's tariff announcements, Brussels was quietly building something different. Not tariffs in the traditional sense, not dramatic political speeches, something far more difficult to escape. Let us look at what Europe is actually building. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, is not simply a carbon tax. It requires importers to report the full carbon footprint of every product, from raw material extraction to final assembly. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, goes even further. It demands that companies prove their entire supply chain meets European environmental and labor standards. Every battery cell, every steel beam, every semiconductor. Regulators increasingly want to know not only where a product is shipped from, but where its materials originated, how it was manufactured, and how much carbon was emitted at every stage. Routing production through Mexico? Completing final assembly in Vietnam? Shipping through third countries? None of these strategies necessarily escape the new regulatory architecture if the underlying supply chain remains Chinese. Because Europe has changed its definition of origin. It is no longer defined by customs paperwork. It is defined by a product's industrial DNA. And this is where the trap begins to close. European policymakers have a clear objective: reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing while maintaining the green transition. But there is a problem. The very technologies needed to achieve Europe's climate objectives, batteries, solar panels, electric vehicle components, are precisely the ones where Chinese firms currently possess overwhelming scale and cost advantages. Europe wants to reduce dependence. Europe also wants to decarbonize. Doing both at the same time has become an extraordinarily difficult balancing act. And this is where Chinese manufacturers have already begun to adapt in ways that Brussels may not have fully anticipated, taking Hungary, taking Poland. Over the past 2 years, billions of dollars of Chinese investment have flowed into these countries. New factories, new supply chains, new logistics hubs. These are European companies on paper. They register under European law. They employ European workers. They pay European taxes. But the technology, the engineering expertise, the equipment, and the supply chain management that still comes from China. This is the strategy one. Localization, not shipping finished products into Europe, but building them inside Europe. The second move goes even deeper. European regulations demand local content. So Chinese companies are increasingly sourcing components from European suppliers, European steel, European plastics, European labor. At first glance, this looks like success for European policy. Domestic suppliers are being used. Local jobs are being created. But the system integration, the digital infrastructure, the production software, the quality control systems remains Chinese. The third move is perhaps the most consequential. Instead of exporting finished products, Chinese companies are increasingly exporting manufacturing capability itself. Production lines, industrial robots, manufacturing execution systems, automation software. These are higher margin. They are more difficult to regulate, and they embed Chinese technology permanently into European factories. Europe is no longer just importing Chinese products. It is importing Chinese ways of making things. And then there is the fourth option, the one that Brussels is most nervous about. Beijing also possesses policy tools of its own. Procurement policies that favor domestic suppliers, investment approvals that can be delayed, standards that can be adjusted, market access that can be restricted, and perhaps most significantly, critical raw materials, many of which are processed primarily in China. Europe's automotive and aerospace industries rely on these materials. If access were constrained, the consequences would be immediate. Not because Beijing would necessarily weaponize these tools, but because the tools exist and everyone knows they exist. That knowledge alone changes the calculation. Over the past dozen minutes, we have traced a 30-year story. Europe chose to outsource manufacturing while keeping design and innovation. China chose to integrate both building ports, supplier clusters, engineering universities, and production capacity at a scale the world had never seen. So where does that leave us? Maybe 3 scenarios from here. Scenario 1. Europe wins. Europe's regulatory strategy works. Chinese exports to Europe fall sharply. CBAM and CSDDD erect barriers that many Chinese manufacturers cannot easily overcome. European domestic production gradually recovers. But there is a cost. Consumers pay more for batteries, solar panels, and EV components as domestic production costs are higher. The green transition slows, climate targets are delayed. Deeper still, Europe has not rebuilt its manufacturing ecosystem. It has only made imports more expensive. Closed factories do not automatically reopen. Moved supply chains do not automatically return. Regulation can build walls, but walls do not build factories. Scenario 2. China adapts. Chinese manufacturers adapt faster than Brussels expected. They build factories in Hungary and Poland, localize supply chains, hire European workers, and register as European entities. On paper, Chinese exports to Europe decline. Trade statistics show a victory. But the reality, Chinese manufacturing has not declined. It has relocated. Products still rely on Chinese technology, equipment, and supply chain management, just assembled inside Europe under European legal structures. Europe wanted fewer Chinese goods crossing its borders. It may end up with more Chinese factories operating inside them. Once those factories pay European taxes and employ European workers, regulators face a dilemma. Do they restrict European companies that are Chinese-owned? Do they deny permits to job-creating facilities? That political calculation becomes far harder after the investment has already landed. The third scenario is neither a return to old globalization nor fragmentation. A new structure emerges. The US dominates semiconductors and AI. China remains the most efficient manufacturing ecosystem. Europe becomes the global regulator. India supplies labor. Southeast Asia handles assembly. Competition is between supply chain blocks, not nations. No country fully controls any major industry. Europe wants to reduce dependence on China, but disentanglement may be impossible not due to politics, but industrial reality. Most analysts miss the key point. Europe is not fighting Chinese exports. It is accelerating the globalization of Chinese manufacturing. Every wall pushes Chinese investment deeper into Europe. Every restriction on finished goods pushes exports of production systems, machinery, software, and expertise harder to regulate and more profitable. Tariffs raise costs for European consumers, while Chinese manufacturers simply shift their model. The problem is no longer about where products are made. It is about who controls the systems that make them. So let us return to where we began, Wolfsburg, a factory that once symbolized German industrial power, now struggling to define its future. Is Europe's regulatory response in the right way? Will it protect European workers? Or will it simply accelerate the transformation of European industry into something that no one in Brussels or Berlin fully understands? The answer is not a victory for either side. It is a question that both Europe and China will have to answer together. Europe wanted fewer Chinese products crossing its borders. It may end up with more Chinese factories inside them instead.